Fence builder found rusted toolbox under old barn. Couldn't sleep for weeks. What was inside it wouldn't let him rest. Not for a long time. Maybe never. Harlan Combs set the parking brake on his old Ford pickup and sat a moment, looking at what remained of the Garrett barn. A structure that had once been worth keeping, but was now just a lean of weathered boards and failed foundation. Its eastern corner sunk into the hillside like a man sitting down without meaning to and finding he couldn't get back up. He'd driven out from Pikeville on Route 23 before 7 in the morning, the haulers still in shadow, the ridge above them just beginning to catch light. Early May in Pike County, Kentucky, warm enough to work without a jacket, but not yet thick with the kind of heat that made a man stop and wonder what he'd been thinking. Good working weather. The kind Harlan Combs had liked his entire life. He pulled on his gloves and unloaded his tools from the truck bed. A long-handled shovel, a mattock, a pry bar, the old canvas bag he'd carried since his 20s, with chisels and a level and a short hammer inside. The new owners of the Garrett property, a couple from Lexington who'd bought it as a rental investment and had never, from what Harlan could tell, spent a night in Pike County, had hired him to remove the barn foundation and clear the footprint for a gravel pad. Clean work, the kind Harlan had done 100 times on 100 old properties scattered through the county. Places where somebody had finally decided the thing that had been standing since their grandfather built it wasn't worth preserving anymore. He didn't rush, he never had. His neighbor Dale Bowers had stopped by on his way to his own shop, which sat about a mile down the same road and specialized in small engine repair and the particular kind of long conversation that men in Pike County had always used to avoid going home when there was nothing urgent waiting. Dale pulled up in his old Chevy, a truck the same age as Dale himself, which was 61 and which sounded like it, and sat in the cab with the window down. "What you doing out here?" Dale called over. "Foundation work, pulling the Garrett barn." "Whole thing?" "Just the foundation. They want it graded out." Dale shook his head in the way he shook his head at most things, which was with more feeling than the situation usually called for. "Be a shame. That barn's been there since my father was in school." "Your father's been dead 20 years, Dale." "That's what I'm saying." He leaned an elbow on the window frame. "You going to find anything interesting under there?" Old farms like this, people used to bury things all the time. Jars of money, whatever they didn't trust the bank with. "I find a buried treasure, I'll split it with you 50-50. 50-50, Dale said, like he was considering whether that was fair. "All right, I'll check in on you later." He drove on, and the sound of his truck engine faded down through the holler, and Harlan was alone with the barn and the morning and the work ahead of him. The barn's interior smelled of old hay and rust and something deeper, earth that hadn't been turned in decades, cold and mineral and patient. Harlan walked the perimeter first, testing each section of floor with his boot, mapping where it was safe to step and where the boards had gone to nothing. He found a bridle still hanging on a nail so rusted it had fused to the wood. He found a wagon wheel rim leaned against the back wall, the wooden spokes long gone, just the iron ring sitting in the dirt, as though it had been set there yesterday, and somebody was expected back to collect it. 3 glass canning jars, sealed, their contents turned dark and unrecognizable. He set them aside carefully. It wasn't his habit to throw away what he didn't understand. That was a rule he'd made for himself a long time ago, working other people's old properties, turning up other people's forgotten things, and it had never failed him. He started at the northwest corner and worked his way around. The foundation was fieldstone, big limestone slabs stacked without mortar, set into the hillside, some of them weighing close to 200 pounds. He worked methodically, loosening each stone before attempting to lift it, using the pry bar to break the seal of packed earth along the edges. Most came up clean. Below them, the soil was dense and dark, compressed by decades of weight above into something approaching stone itself. Around mid-morning, he stopped for water. He sat on the tailgate and drank from a thermos and looked at the ridgeline above the property, the tree line dark green and motionless. He'd been working Pike County properties his entire adult life. 40-some years of other people's barns and fence lines and collapsed root cellars, of pulling up what had been buried and building new what needed building. There was a satisfying finality to it that he'd never tried to explain to anyone because he wasn't sure he had the words. Things had a use, or they didn't. A fence kept livestock in, or it didn't. A foundation held, or it failed. He'd always been better with the physical than the verbal, better with what he could see and measure and correct. He finished his water and went back to work. He was working the eastern corner, which had sunk deepest into the hillside, the whole structural weight of that side bearing down into soft ground over the years, when his shovel struck something that wasn't stone. He stopped. The sound was dull and metallic, different from limestone. He crouched and used his hands to clear the soil away from whatever he'd hit, working with his fingers before using the blade of the shovel to pry gently around the edges. 8 inches below the surface, beneath the last course of foundation stones, he found it. A box of some kind, metal, so corroded it had gone the color of dried blood, the surface eaten down to a rough lace of rust that still held its shape. He freed it carefully. The earth had packed around it so tightly that he had to cut along the edges with the pry bar, breaking the seal of compressed soil on each side before the thing would release. When it finally came free, he lifted it and felt the weight, heavier than the size suggested, maybe 12 inches long and 8 inches wide and 3 inches deep. A toolbox, the kind a working man carried from job to job. The clasp had rusted completely through, but the lid was still sealed by the pressure of years and corrosion. He set it on the ground beside him and looked at it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he worked the lid open with the blade of the pry bar, prying at one corner, then the next, walking the seam until the corrosion broke and the lid came free. Inside, packed in what had once been oilcloth, now mostly dissolved, just a stain, were tools. Carpenter's tools. A hammer, the head dark with rust but intact. 3 chisels of different widths. A handsaw, the blade stained but the teeth visible. All of them old. All of them corroded. All of them placed deliberately inside the box, not thrown in, but arranged. Hammer at the bottom. Chisels nested beside each other, smallest to largest. Saw laid flat on top. Harlan picked up the hammer. He turned it in his hands. Into the wooden handle, carved with something sharp and deliberate, a knife point or a chisel, were 2 letters. R.P. He set the hammer down and picked up the nearest chisel. Same initials, cut into the side of the handle, deep enough that they'd held through 30 years of rust. R.P. He checked the other chisels, the same. He lifted the handsaw and found the initials burned into the wood near the grip. Not carved, but branded, done with something hot, patient, and careful. R.P. Harlan sat back on his heels and looked at those 2 letters for a long time. A crow called somewhere in the timber above the property and went quiet. The morning held its stillness. His shadow fell across the box. He knew those initials. He knew them because he had lived in Pike County his entire 64 years, and because in the August of 1995, a year he remembered clearly, a summer he had never quite been able to file away into the past, a fire had burned the Caldwell Outfitter business to the ground at the edge of Pikeville. 15 people had lost their jobs in a single night. The fire had taken the building and the equipment and the vehicles and most of what had made the business worth anything. It had been the biggest fire the county had seen in a decade. The smoke had been visible from 3 ridges away. People had driven out to the roadside and stood there watching the glow and shaking their heads, not saying much, which was what people in Pike County did when something large and bad happened. A man had been arrested for it within a week. Raymond Pruitt. R.P. Harlan remembered the trial. 4 days. The conviction had surprised no one. The sentence, 30 years, had seemed right and final and just to a community that had been frightened and angry and relieved all at once to have a name to put to the damage. Raymond had protested his innocence. People said that was what guilty men did. Raymond had claimed his tools were stolen. People said that was what desperate men claimed when the evidence had already spoken. Deputy Dwayne Caldwell had led the investigation himself. The jury had deliberated 2 hours. Life had gone on. Raymond Pruitt had died in prison 4 years ago at 67 years old. And now Harlan was holding Raymond's hammer, Raymond's chisels, Raymond's saw. Tools that had been documented at trial as found at the fire scene. Tools that were supposed to be in an evidence locker or long since disposed of after the case closed and the sentence was served. Tools that had been buried 8 inches beneath a barn foundation, wrapped in oilcloth, deliberately placed, deliberately hidden. He tried to think of an explanation that wasn't the one he'd already arrived at. He was methodical. He was patient. He gave it a fair effort, sitting there in the dirt with the rusted box across his lap and the initials looking back at him. He couldn't get there. Nobody lost a toolbox 8 inches under a limestone foundation. Nobody misplaced their tools in a layer of soil that had been compacted by 30 years of weight. Somebody had put this here. Somebody had put it here so it wouldn't be found. Harlan sat still while the shadow of the barn's west wall moved 2 feet across the ground. That meant close to an hour had passed. He was aware of it the way a man is aware of time when he can't do anything useful with it. Then he stood, picked up the toolbox, and carried it to the bed of his truck. He didn't finish the job that day. He drove back toward Pikeville with the toolbox riding in the bed behind him. In the whole drive, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting 30 years for someone to come along and look in the right corner of the earth. And whoever had buried it had been certain, had been sure, that no one ever would. Harlan set the toolbox on his workbench at 6:15 that evening and stood looking at it under the garage light, the way a man looks at something he isn't sure he should have brought inside. The garage was a single-car structure off the back of his house in Pikeville. Concrete floor, pegboard walls with tools hanging on it in outlines he'd drawn himself with a marker 20 years ago, so he'd know at a glance if anything was missing. Oil smell and sawdust smell, and the particular cold of a space that has a heater, but that you don't fire up until the temperature drops below 40. He hadn't fired it up yet tonight. He wasn't ready to settle in. He put on a pot of coffee in the kitchen, came back out to the garage, and stood looking at the toolbox some more. Then he went to the back corner, where a metal shelving unit held tools and spare parts, and, on the bottom shelf, a cardboard box he'd been adding to since around 1980. He pulled the box out and set it on the workbench beside the rusted toolbox. Inside was everything he'd ever clipped from the Pike County newspaper that he'd thought worth keeping. Obituaries of men he'd worked for. Stories about road projects and county disputes. A photograph from 1991 when the highway came through and took out a stretch of farmland that had been in the Garrett family for 80 years. Various things. He was not a sentimental man by nature, but he had always believed that the record of what happened mattered, even if nobody ever looked at it again. He found the Pruitt clippings in about 10 minutes, which told him he'd filed them toward the back of the box, which meant they'd been kept without being revisited. 3 articles, one from the week of the fire, one from the arrest, one from the trial's end. He poured his coffee and read them in order. The fire had started in the early hours of the 14th of August, 1995, a Thursday. The Caldwell Outdoor Outfitters building on Hambly Boulevard in Pikeville. The fire department had received the call at 2:17 in the morning and had arrived to find the structure fully involved. The fire had consumed the building in roughly 90 minutes. Total loss. The cause had been determined as arson within 48 hours, multiple points of ignition, accelerant used, clear pattern of intentional start. 15 employees were out of work by morning. The second article covered the arrest. Deputy Dwayne Caldwell had led the investigation personally. This had been noted in the article without comment, as though it were natural for a deputy to investigate a fire at a business that bore his own surname, which, Harlan realized now, it was not. That should have raised a question. It hadn't raised one then. The deputy's name and the business name being the same had simply not registered as significant to anyone, apparently including the reporter. The article listed the evidence: Raymond Pruitt's toolbox found at the scene, bearing his initials. His fingerprints on 2 gasoline cans recovered from the property. A confidential source who stated he'd seen Raymond near the building the evening before the fire. Raymond had been arrested 6 days after the fire. He had insisted he was innocent. He said his tools might have been stolen. He had no alibi. He was working alone, as was his custom. The trial was swift. The jury deliberated 2 hours. Guilty on counts of arson, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. Raymond was sentenced to 30 years. He died in prison in 2020 at age 67, 4 years before Harlan found the toolbox. Now Harlan pulled more details. He called the county courthouse and spoke with an old clerk named Ruth. Ruth had worked there since 1985. Harlan asked her about the Pruitt case. Was the evidence log complete? Were Raymond's tools ever officially documented? Ruth said she'd have to check the archives, but that her memory was the case was straightforward. Raymond was guilty. No one disputed it. The next morning, Ruth called back. She'd found the evidence log. The toolbox with Raymond's tools was logged as found at the scene. But there was something odd in the documentation. The discovery location was listed differently on 2 separate pages. On one page, the location read Business Exterior near Gasoline Storage. On another page, it read Business Foundation, Rear. The inconsistency was minor, but it troubled Ruth. She asked Harlan why he was asking about a 30-year-old case. Harlan explained that he'd found tools buried under the Garrett barn, and the tools had Raymond's initials. Ruth went silent. Then she said, "I'll call the state police. This needs to be documented by someone other than local authorities." Harlan thanked her and hung up. He drove home. He worked on a fence repair he had pending, a property over on Johns Creek Road where a flood the previous spring had undermined 2 sections of post and rail, and the owner had been patient about it longer than most would have been. He worked steadily through the afternoon, setting new posts, tamping the concrete, measuring and remeasuring. The physical work settled him in a way that thinking never had. His hands knew what they were doing. His hands were reliable. But when he drove home that evening, the toolbox was still on the workbench where he'd left it, and he stood looking at it again for a while before he went inside for supper. He had kept the newspaper clippings because he believed the record of what happened mattered. He had believed that his entire adult life. It had always seemed like an abstract conviction, the kind of thing you hold without ever testing it. Now he understood it was going to be tested. The question was whether he still believed it when the record being corrected was one the community had long ago agreed to accept. He thought about Raymond Pruitt the one time he'd seen him working, at the Holbrook property on Island Creek Road. Good work, clean lines, a man who took his time and got it right. They had nodded across a property line. That was all. Harlan had not thought of him again until the day of the arrest, when the paper had his name on the front page, and then he had thought, well, that explains it, and moved on with his morning. That easy, that fast. The whole thing filed away in 2 seconds over a cup of coffee. He stood in the garage in the dark for a while, not turning the light on. The toolbox was a shape on the workbench, barely visible. He thought about the oilcloth wrapping. He thought about the way the tools had been arranged, not thrown in, but placed. Smallest chisel to largest, hammer underneath, saw on top. The care of it. Someone had wrapped those tools and arranged them and buried them and expected them to stay buried for a very long time. That took a particular kind of confidence. The confidence of a man who believed he controlled what stayed hidden and what came to light. That confidence had been wrong by 8 inches and 30 years. Ruth called at 8:15 the next morning. "I found the evidence log," she said. "It took me most of yesterday to locate the original file. They'd moved the archived cases to a storage room in the basement around 2012, and the filing system from before that isn't well organized." She paused. "Harlan, there's something odd in here. Tell me." The toolbox, Raymond Pruitt's toolbox, the one listed as found at the scene. It's documented on 2 separate pages of the evidence log. Standard procedure would be 1 entry, 1 location. But there are 2 entries. On the first page, the discovery location is listed as Business Exterior near Gasoline Storage. On the second page, the same item is listed as Business Foundation Rear. She let that sit for a moment. Those are 2 different locations on the property. They can't both be right. Harlan didn't say anything for a moment. Outside his kitchen window, the ridge was green and still. Both entries are signed by Deputy Caldwell, Ruth continued. Both are dated the same day, different times, one at 6 in the morning, one at 10:15. And the second entry has a note in the margin. It says location corrected, but there's nothing else. No explanation of why it was corrected or who authorized the correction. Ruth. "I know," she said. "I know what this looks like." "What are you going to do with it?" He heard her take a slow breath. "I'm going to call the state police. I've been sitting here since yesterday afternoon trying to think of another way to handle it, and there isn't one. This needs to be documented by someone outside this county's system. I'm sorry, Harlan. I know this opens something up." "Don't be sorry," Harlan said. "Are you going to be all right?" "I don't know yet," he said, and that was the honest answer. He thanked her and set the phone back in the cradle and stood in his kitchen for a while. The coffee was on the stove. He didn't pour any. He went out to the garage and stood at the workbench and looked at the rusted toolbox with Raymond Pruitt's tools inside it, and he understood that the call to Ruth had been the last moment when any of this could have stayed quiet. That moment was gone now. Ruth was a woman who did her job thoroughly and without sentiment, and if she said she was calling the state police, then the state police were going to get a call. He stood in the garage until the light through the single window shifted to late afternoon. Then he heard a truck slow down on the road in front of his property, not stopping, just slowing, engine idling down for a few seconds, and then speed back up and drive on. He didn't recognize the sound of the engine. He wasn't in the habit of cataloging the sounds of trucks on that road. He had never needed to be. He thought about it for longer than made sense, and that told him something. Marcus Webb arrived 3 days after Ruth made her call, which was 3 days faster than Harlan had expected. He drove a state-plated Chevy sedan, dark blue, and he was younger than Harlan had pictured, mid-40s, lean, with the kind of stillness that comes from years of listening to people say things they wish they hadn't said. He introduced himself at the door with a badge and a firm handshake, and asked if they could talk in the garage, where Harlan had told him on the phone the toolbox was being kept. "You left it right where you said it?" Marcus asked, looking at the workbench. "Touched it the night I brought it home," Harlan said. "Opened it up and looked at the tools. Nothing since then." "That's good." Marcus set down a case and took out a camera, a proper one, not a phone, and began photographing the toolbox from every angle before he touched it. He was methodical about it in a way that Harlan recognized and respected, measuring twice. Then he put on gloves and opened the lid and photographed the contents in place, before removing each tool individually, placing each one on a clean cloth, photographing it separately. "The initials are carved on each one," Harlan said. "I can see that." Marcus held the hammer under the garage light. "RP, you said you knew whose initials these were before you made the call." "Raymond Pruitt. Convicted of arson in 1995. He's dead now, died in prison 4 years ago." Marcus set the hammer down carefully. "How'd you know the initials were his?" "Lived here my whole life. His name was in the paper for years. I kept the clippings." Harlan indicated the cardboard box still sitting on the lower shelf of the workbench. "I can show you those too." "I'd like that." Marcus took a last round of photographs, then began bagging each tool individually in clear evidence bags, labeling each one with a marker. Slow, patient work. The garage was quiet except for the sound of the bag sealing and the markers scratching across the labels. "Mr. Combs, in your estimation, based on the depth, the soil compaction, the condition of the oilcloth, how long do you think this toolbox had been buried?" Harlan considered that. "Ground that deep under that weight of foundation stone compacts at a predictable rate in this kind of soil. The oilcloth was nearly gone, took at least 20 years for that kind of breakdown in dry conditions. The rust on the tools was deep, not surface. I'd say 30 years, could be 25, not less." Marcus zipped the last evidence bag and straightened up. The Pruitt conviction was in 1995, 30 years ago this summer. He looked at Harlan steadily. Is there anything else about the discovery site you haven't told me? Anything you noticed but figured wasn't relevant? Harlan thought about it honestly. The oilcloth was under the tools as well as around them. Whoever packed this knew what they were doing. They weren't in a hurry. The placement was deliberate. Tools arranged, not thrown in. That's not how you hide something you're panicking over. That's how you hide something when you've got time and a plan. Marcus wrote something in a small notebook.
"All right," he said. "Thank you." He took the toolbox and the evidence bags and the clippings Harlan had copied at the courthouse the day before and drove back toward Pikeville. Harlan stood in the garage doorway and watched the state-plated Chevy go down the road and turn at the bottom of the hill. And then he went inside and made lunch and sat at the kitchen table and ate it without tasting much of it. What Marcus found when he pulled the complete case file from the Pike County Sheriff's Office, Harlan learned in pieces over the following days. Some of it from Marcus directly in brief phone calls, some of it from Ruth, who was in a position to see what was being requested and by whom. The picture that assembled itself was not good. The original investigation documents were incomplete. Not obviously incomplete if you weren't looking for gaps, but incomplete once you started counting what should have been there and wasn't. Evidence photographs were referenced in the log, but missing from the physical file. Chain of custody signatures were broken in multiple places, meaning items had changed hands without proper documentation. The discovery location inconsistency Ruth had found was not the only one. There were 3 others in the same file, smaller discrepancies, easy to overlook individually, but together forming a pattern that was harder to explain away. Marcus interviewed the retired trial judge, a man named Fitch, who had presided from a county bench for 22 years before retiring to a farmhouse outside Pikeville. The judge was 81 now, still sharp, and when Marcus laid the documentation in front of him, the judge studied it for a long time without speaking. Then he said he trusted the deputy's evidence presentation because he'd trusted the deputy in prior cases and had no reason to question it. He said he should perhaps have scrutinized the evidence log more closely. He said this with the particular heaviness of a man who has realized at 81 that something he did 30 years ago was wrong and that there is no useful way to correct it now. Marcus interviewed the original trial prosecutor, a man named Gentry who had moved on to county attorney and a bigger caseload, and who received Marcus in his office on a Tuesday afternoon. When Marcus laid out the inconsistencies, the prosecutor's face went through several expressions quickly and then settled into something pale and careful. He said he'd relied on Deputy Caldwell's evidence presentation entirely. He said the case had seemed straightforward. He said, if the toolbox location was falsified, Caldwell did it. He was the only person with access to both the evidence and the documentation at that stage of the investigation. He said this quietly and then added, I had no reason to doubt him. That's the truth, and I know how little it's worth now. Word traveled, the way it always traveled in Pike County, which was faster than it should have, and not as completely as people assumed. By the end of that first week, enough people in the county courthouse and the sheriff's office knew that an old case was under review, that the knowledge had moved outward through the ordinary channels of small county life. A comment at a lunch counter, a question asked at the wrong moment in a corridor, the particular silence that falls when a name is mentioned and everyone in the room already knows something about it. Dwayne Caldwell heard it from Sheriff Hayes on a Wednesday evening. Hayes was in his 50s and had come up through the department during the last 10 years of Caldwell's career. He had a deep institutional respect for Caldwell that was entirely genuine and entirely separate from the question of whether Caldwell had done something wrong. Hayes called Caldwell at home and told him that a state police investigator had come to the county regarding a piece of evidence connected to the Pruitt arson case from '95, and that the department was cooperating with the inquiry as required by law. Caldwell asked what the new evidence was. Hayes said he couldn't share details of an active investigation. Caldwell asked who had brought the evidence forward. Hayes said he couldn't share that either. Caldwell thanked him and hung up. And the next morning he drove out to the Garrett property on his own, in his personal truck, a newer Ford, dark green.
and stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at the hole where the barn foundation had been and understood what had come up out of the earth. Harlan heard about that visit from Dale Bowers, who had driven past and seen a man he didn't recognize standing at the edge of the site. Dale had a habit of noticing unfamiliar vehicles on roads he traveled daily, and he called Harlan that afternoon. "Big green Ford, late model," Dale said. "Man standing at the edge of your dig site, 60-some years old, silver hair, good posture." "You know who that is?" Harlan said he thought he might. "You want to tell me what's going on out there?" Dale asked. "Not yet," Harlan said. "Give me a little more time." Dale paused. "All right," he said. He let it go, which was not like Dale, and the fact that he let it go told Harlan that Dale had already heard something and had decided not to press. People in Pike County were good at knowing when to press and when to wait. Dale was better than most. That evening, at 6:45, Harlan heard tires on the gravel of his driveway. He looked out the kitchen window and saw the dark green Ford pulling in. He watched the man get out. Dwayne Caldwell had not changed dramatically in the 30 years since Harlan had last spoken to him. Older, heavier through the middle, the hair that used to be dark now fully silver. But he carried himself the same way he always had, with the particular ease of a man who had spent his career being the most authoritative person in most of the rooms he entered. He walked toward Harlan's front door without looking around first, the way a man walks toward a door he expects to be opened. Harlan opened it before he knocked. They looked at each other for a moment. "Evening, Harlan," Caldwell said. "Dwayne. Mind if I come in for a minute?" It wasn't exactly a question. Harlan stepped back and let him in. They sat at the kitchen table. Harlan didn't offer coffee and Caldwell didn't ask for it. Caldwell set his hands flat on the table and looked at them briefly and then looked at Harlan with an expression that managed to be both reasonable and watchful at the same time. "I know what you found," Caldwell said. "Out at the Garrett property." "Then you know what I know," Harlan said. "I know what you think you know," Caldwell's voice was even. Not warm, but not threatening either. The voice of a man explaining something patiently, the way you explain something to someone who hadn't yet understood the full picture. "Raymond Pruitt was not a good man, Harlan. I worked that investigation personally. I saw the evidence. I followed every lead. The case was solid." "The toolbox wasn't at the fire scene," Harlan said. Caldwell didn't answer that directly. He turned his hands over on the table and looked at his palms briefly, like he was reading something there, and then folded them together. "What I'm asking you to consider," he said, "is what happens to this community if you push this. You've lived here your whole life. You know what law enforcement means to people in a county like this. You know what happens to confidence when an institution fails publicly. One bad case, one case that maybe had some documentation errors, some procedural things that weren't handled perfectly, doesn't erase 28 years of work that kept this county safer. It doesn't erase the people who are alive today because of investigations that were done right." "Raymond Pruitt isn't alive today," Harlan said. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "He's not." He stood up from the table. He adjusted his jacket. He looked at Harlan with an expression that was almost something like regret, if regret and warning could share the same face. "Raymond Pruitt had a daughter," he said, almost as an afterthought. "Lives somewhere in the county still, I believe. Struggling from what I hear. You dig this up, really dig it up, all the way. You're going to put her name back in the papers. Her father's name. Her children's grandfather's name. People have long memories in these mountains. Is that what she'd want? Did you think to ask her?" He thanked Harlan for his time and let himself out. Harlan sat at the kitchen table for a long while after the sound of the Ford had faded down the hill. The question was still in the air, and it was a real question, and that was the most troubling thing about it. Caldwell had used it as a weapon, but it was still a real question. He hadn't thought to ask Thelma Pruitt anything. He didn't know if she knew. He didn't know what she'd want, and he understood now that Caldwell knew he hadn't thought of her and had known that it would land. The week after Caldwell's visit was the worst sleep Harlan had managed in years.
He would lie down and close his eyes, and the conversation would replay itself in the dark. Caldwell's hands flat on the table, Caldwell's voice even and patient, Caldwell's question about Thelma Pruitt hanging in the air of the kitchen long after the sound of the Ford had gone. He would get up around 3 in the morning and sit in the kitchen with the light off and watch the shadow of the ridge against the sky until the birds started, and then go back to bed for an hour or two of something that wasn't quite sleep. He didn't work that week. He called and rescheduled the jobs he had pending, a post and rail repair over in Elkhorn City, and a gate rehang for a woman over on Pond Creek Road who had been waiting 3 weeks already and deserved better. He told each of them something had come up. They were decent people, and they said it was fine. Dale Bowers called twice. Harlan let the phone ring. He sat on the porch in the evenings and looked at the ridge and tried to think his way through the center of it, which was what he always did when a problem was real and not amenable to easier handling. The porch boards were soft in one corner, something he'd been meaning to fix for 2 seasons. He noticed it under his boot each time he shifted his weight and filed it away again. The thing he kept arriving at was Dwayne Caldwell at 32 years old. Harlan had been 15 when Caldwell was an assistant coach on the high school baseball team in Pikeville, 1976. A lean and serious young man with dark hair and a way of standing at the edge of the practice field with his arms crossed that communicated, without any particular effort, that this was a person who understood what was supposed to happen and expected it to happen. He had not been cruel the way some coaches were cruel. He had not needed to be. He had a quality, the quality of a man who had internalized a set of rules and found that the rules worked, that made you want to meet his standard, not from fear of punishment, but from something closer to respect. Harlan had not been a particularly good ball player, but he had worked harder on that team than he had worked at anything in his young life, and some part of that was Caldwell standing at the edge of the field. He had watched Caldwell move through the decades after that the way you watched any figure of authority in a small county, at a distance, through the paper and through the community's ongoing conversation about its own institutions. Caldwell had gone to the sheriff's department at 25, had made deputy at 28, had worked Pike County crime for the better part of 3 decades. He had been present at floods and accidents and disputes and the slow, ordinary wreckage that people inflicted on each other in hard times. And by all accounts, he had conducted himself with the steadiness that the job required. People trusted him. The county's trust in Caldwell had not been naive or unconsidered. It had been earned over time and maintained without major incident. And all of that was built on a foundation that included what he had done to Raymond Pruitt. Harlan sat with that for a long time. He sat with the fact that Caldwell had been, in the main, what he appeared to be, a capable and dedicated officer, and had also, at one point, done something that destroyed an innocent man's life. He sat with the fact that both things could be true, and that the second one did not cancel the first, but was also not canceled by it. He had never been a man who thought in simple terms about other people. He had worked other people's land for 40 years and had learned that almost nothing about a human life was simple if you looked at it closely enough. But this was not an abstract case of human complexity. This was a man he had known. A man who had stood in his kitchen 3 nights ago and asked him, in reasonable tones, to let a dead man stay buried. On the 4th day, he called Marcus Webb. "I've been thinking," Harlan said when Marcus picked up. "About what I told you." "All right," Marcus said. He didn't encourage or discourage, just waited. "The toolbox. I said it was deliberately buried. I'm not sure that's right anymore. Raymond Pruitt worked construction all over this county. He worked to Garrett property in the early 90s. I looked it up. There's a record of it at the county building office. He could have left the box there, buried his own tools for some reason, and then never went back." The line was quiet for 3 or 4 seconds. "Why would he do that?" Marcus said. "People do things for reasons that don't make sense later." "He was convicted of arson in 95, Marcus said. "He died in prison in 2020. He never went back because he spent the last 25 years of his life in a correctional facility.
And you're suggesting he buried his own toolbox 8 inches under a barn foundation, a foundation that was intact, and then somehow accessed the barn from below to do it. Harlan didn't answer. "Mr. Combs," Marcus said, with the same quiet steadiness he'd shown in the garage. "Someone spoke with you. Between when we last talked and right now, someone spoke with you and suggested you revise your account. I want you to know that I'm going to document this conversation in my report. The reversal in your account, the timing of it, all of that gets documented. And if someone threatened you or pressured you into changing your statement, that is itself a serious crime. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," Harlan said. "Good. You don't have to tell me anything else right now. But I want you to hear this clearly. The investigation is going to continue, regardless of what you say to me today. The toolbox is already in evidence. The documentation inconsistencies are already on record. Your account of the discovery is already documented. You cannot unring that bell by making a phone call." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the ridge was green and still under an overcast sky. "I know," he said finally. And he did know. He had known since he made the call. He had just needed to hear it from someone else. "Take care of yourself," Marcus said. "I'll be in touch." Marcus accelerated the investigation after that, which was what Harlan had expected, and which was, in the end, what Harlan had wanted, even when he was trying to stop it. Within 4 days, Marcus had obtained a warrant for Caldwell's home and property. The search was conducted on a Thursday morning by state police officers and 2 investigators from the Attorney General's office. Harlan heard about it from Ruth, who heard about it from the courthouse, which heard about it the same way small counties always heard about things, in fragments, fast. What they found in Caldwell's house was worse than Harlan had allowed himself to imagine. Marcus called him on a Friday evening, just past 6 o'clock, and his voice had changed in a way that Harlan couldn't precisely name. The same steadiness as before, but with something underneath it, something that might have been the weight of what a man accumulates when he spends his career looking at what people do to each other. "I want to tell you what we found," Marcus said, "because I think you've earned that, and because some of it's going to be in the press soon, and I'd rather you hear it from me first." "All right," Harlan said. "In Caldwell's home office, in a locked file cabinet, we found copies of the missing evidence photographs from the original Pruitt investigation. The photographs that were referenced in the evidence log but absent from the official file. Caldwell had kept them. We also found a folder of correspondence between Caldwell and a man named David Hoskins. Hoskins was the confidential witness in the trial, the man who claimed he saw Raymond Pruitt near the outfitter property the night before the fire." Harlan felt his grip tighten on the phone receiver. The correspondence spans about 3 months before and after the trial, Marcus continued. It documents cash payments from Caldwell to Hoskins totaling $5,000. In exchange for testimony that Hoskins later documented, in his own handwriting in these letters, was entirely fabricated. He never saw Raymond Pruitt near that property. Caldwell paid him to say he did. "Lord," Harlan said quietly. "There's one more thing. In the same file cabinet, with the photographs and the correspondence, there was a personal photograph. It shows Raymond Pruitt standing on a completed deck, well-built work, you can tell, with a woman. The woman's name, based on other documents in the file, is Margaret Caldwell, Dwayne Caldwell's ex-wife. They were divorced in 1993, 2 years before the fire." Marcus paused. "Raymond Pruitt built that deck for her, Harlan. Caldwell kept the photograph for 30 years. There are handwritten notes on the back of it that I'm not going to read to you, but the content suggests that Caldwell's relationship with his ex-wife and with Raymond Pruitt was not, as we might have assumed, simply professional or incidental." Harlan stood in his kitchen and said nothing for a long moment. "He framed Raymond because of jealousy," Harlan said. "It wasn't a question." "That's the direction the evidence points," Marcus said. "We'll let the Attorney General's office make the formal determination, but yes, the arrest warrant for Dwayne Caldwell was issued the following Monday morning by the State Attorney General's office. State police officers arrived at Caldwell's house on Tunnel Mill Road at 7:15 that morning.
Caldwell was at home. He did not resist. He came to the door already dressed, as if he'd been expecting it, and he was escorted to a state vehicle without incident, and the vehicle drove away from Pike County toward Pikeville and then north toward the federal courthouse in Lexington. Harlan read about it in the afternoon paper, which he'd picked up at the gas station on Hambly. The story was on the front page, below the fold, modest placement for the moment, before the details came out, before anyone outside the county fully understood what it meant. A retired Pike County deputy arrested on charges of fabrication of evidence, conspiracy, perjury, and witness intimidation. A case 30 years old, overturned by a rusted toolbox found beneath a barn foundation. Harlan sat in the parking lot of the gas station and read the article twice, and then folded the paper and set it on the passenger seat of his truck. He thought about Caldwell at 32, standing at the edge of the practice field with his arms crossed. He thought about what it cost a man to hold a grievance for 2 years and then act on it the way Caldwell had acted on it. And he thought about Raymond Pruitt, age 42, being led out of a Pike County courtroom in handcuffs for something he had not done, and what that man had understood in that moment, and what he had understood every day of the 25 years that followed. Marcus Webb's voice was still in his ear. You cannot unring that bell. Harlan had tried to, and he hadn't been able to, and that had turned out to be the right outcome. He knew that. He still felt it sitting in his chest like a stone. He started the truck and drove home, and that evening the phone rang, and he let it ring. 2 days after the arrest, Harlan went back to work. There was nothing else useful to do, and the fence repair on Johns Creek Road had been waiting long enough. He drove out in the early morning, loaded his post driver and bags of concrete mix into the truck bed, and made the trip through the holler in the gray light before the sun cleared the ridge. The woman who owned the property, a retired school teacher named Vera, brought him coffee at 8 o'clock and set it on the tailgate without asking if he wanted it, and went back inside. He drank it standing in the field, looking at the collapsed sections of fence that the spring flood had pushed inward, and then left there when it receded. Straightforward work. Unhook the damaged rails, pull the undermined posts, set new ones, hang the rails back true and level. His hands knew what to do. He let them do it. He ate his lunch in the truck around noon. Cornbread and a boiled egg and a bottle of water. The same lunch he'd been eating on job sites since his wife had passed 9 years ago, and he'd had to figure out for himself what a man eats in the middle of a workday. He sat with the engine off and the window down, and the sounds of the holler around him, creek sound, bird sound, the distant complaint of a tractor on a property somewhere behind the ridge. And he let himself think about what was coming, because he'd been not thinking about it all morning, and he couldn't not think about it indefinitely. The trial. Harlan was going to testify at the trial. Marcus had not explicitly told him this yet, but he knew it the way you know a thing when the logic of events makes it inevitable. He had found the toolbox. He had made the call to Ruth. He had received Caldwell's visit. He had, briefly and uselessly, tried to retract what he knew. All of that was documented. All of that placed him at the center of a federal trial that was going to be covered by papers outside Pike County, papers from Lexington and Louisville, and maybe further. Papers that would put his name in the public record, alongside the name of a retired law enforcement officer who had destroyed an innocent man's life for jealousy. The county would divide over it. Some people would call him a man of integrity. Others would call him the man who had brought down Dwayne Caldwell, who had dismantled 30 years of trust in a single act of what some would characterize as self-righteousness. He would have to live in Pike County with both of those judgments for the rest of his life. He was 64. That was not a brief remainder. He sat with that. He was honest about how much it cost him. He did not perform indifference he didn't feel. And then he thought about Raymond Pruitt at 42, stepping into a Pike County courtroom with a public defender and no alibi, with tools bearing his initials placed at the scene of a fire he had not set, with a witness who had been paid the lie about seeing him, and with a deputy who had spent 2 years nursing a grievance and then acted on it with the full institutional authority of his office.
He thought about what Raymond must have felt in that courtroom, what it was to be innocent and to watch the apparatus of justice, a thing you had no reason to distrust because most people have no reason to distrust it until it turns, assemble itself methodically against you. And then 30 years in a cell. And then dying in that cell 4 years ago, with the world's record showing him as guilty. Harlan finished his water and got out of the truck and went back to work. The phone rang at 6:15 that evening. He was in the kitchen heating soup on the stove, and he answered it expecting Marcus Webb or possibly Dale Bowers, who had called 3 times that week and whose patience with Harlan's silence was clearly approaching its limit. The voice on the other end was a woman's, and he didn't recognize it. "Is this Harlan Combs?" she asked. "It is." "Mr. Combs." A pause. He could hear her composing herself, not falling apart, just taking a breath the way a person does when they're about to say something they've rehearsed and aren't sure they can get through. "My name is Thelma Pruitt. Raymond Pruitt was my father." Harlan turned the burner off under the soup. He sat down at the kitchen table. "I know who you are," he said. "I didn't know if you would. I got your number from the county directory. I hope that's all right." She paused again. "I've been trying to call for 2 days. I'd pick up the phone and put it back down." I'm not entirely sure what I want to say to you. I just knew I needed to say something." "Take your time," Harlan said. 2 days ago," she said, "I had a state police officer knock on my door and tell me that my father's conviction was based on fabricated evidence. That the deputy who led the investigation had planted the evidence himself, that a witness was paid to lie." Her voice was steady and careful, in the way of someone who has been crying for 2 days and has temporarily run out of it. "I'm 58 years old, Mr. Combs. My father went to prison when I was 28. I have spent 30 years, my whole adult life more or less, knowing that my father was in prison for burning down a building. That knowledge is, you carry it differently depending on the day, but you always carry it. My children grew up knowing their grandfather was in prison for arson. They believed he was guilty. I believed he was guilty. He told us he wasn't, every time we visited, every letter he sent, and I—" She stopped. "Miss Pruitt," Harlan said quietly, "I'm sorry. I told myself I wasn't going to do this. You don't have to apologize for anything." "My father died 4 years ago," she said. "He died in that prison. He died with the state of Kentucky's record showing him as a man who committed arson. His grandchildren, my children, they never got to know him as anything else. And now, I'm being told that it was done to him, that he didn't do any of it, that some man with a grudge used his position and his authority to destroy my father's life because—" She stopped again. When she came back, her voice was different, quieter, more contained. "Because of jealousy, because of a woman my father once knew. That's what they're telling me." "That's what the evidence says," Harlan said. "Yes." "I called to thank you," she said. "I know that I don't know what it sounds like. But I needed to say it to the person who found it. You found it. You made the call. And now the truth is on record. My father's name is going to be on record as an innocent man. He'll never know that. He died not knowing it. But I know it. My children will know it. And that—" Her voice broke briefly and then held. "That matters, Mr. Combs. That matters more than I know how to tell you." Harlan's eyes were wet. He didn't try to do anything about it. "I'm sorry I didn't question it sooner," he said. "I'm sorry it took 30 years and a shovel in the right corner of the earth." "You found it," she said. "That's what you can do. You can only find what's there to find." She paused. "Will you testify at the trial?" "Yes," Harlan said. He hadn't decided it until the word came out of his mouth, and then he understood he had decided it some time ago and simply hadn't said it yet. "Thank you," Thelma said. And then, after a moment, "I hope you know that what you did, the finding of it, and then the not staying quiet about it, that was the right thing. I know it's cost you something. I know how people in a place like this talk about a man who turns over something the community has agreed to leave alone. I know that's what you're carrying." "It's lighter than what you've been carrying," Harlan said. She didn't answer that. She thanked him again, and they said goodbye, and he sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. The next morning he called Marcus Webb and gave his full statement, the unrevised one, the true account, beginning with the shovel striking metal in the eastern corner of the Garrett barn and ending with Caldwell sitting at his kitchen table asking him to consider whether Thelma Pruitt really wanted her father's name in the papers. He told it straight and left nothing out. Marcus documented it and thanked him and told him to expect a formal subpoena for testimony. That afternoon, Harlan drove to the cemetery on the east side of Pikeville where Raymond Pruitt was buried. He had to ask at the office because he didn't know the section, and the young man there walked him to the row and pointed. The stone was simple, gray granite, small, the kind a family buys when they don't have much money. Raymond Pruitt, the stone read, with his birth year and the year of his death, and nothing else. Harlan stood in front of it for a while. The grass around the stone was neatly cut, which meant someone came to tend it, which meant Thelma came. He thought about that, Thelma coming to stand here, the same way Harlan was standing now, carrying her grief and her shame to a piece of granite, however often it was that she could manage it. 30 years of that. He remembered the county fair in the fall of '95, 6 weeks after Raymond's conviction. He had been there with his wife. The fair had been full and loud and normal, the same as every year. Livestock judging, the smell of funnel cake, kids running the midway. He remembered thinking, briefly, that the summer had been a hard one, and it was good to be past it, and then turning back to the normal business of being alive in Pike County. He had not thought of Raymond Pruitt once that evening, not once. He had accepted the verdict and filed it away and moved on, the way everyone had, because that was what you did when the institutions worked and justice was served and the weight was carried by the right person. Except the weight had not been carried by the right person, and Harlan had been at the fair eating funnel cake. He put his hand on the stone. The granite was warm from the afternoon sun. "I know the truth now," he said. He said it quietly to the stone, feeling only mildly foolish. "I'm going to say it in a courtroom. Everybody's going to hear it. Your name's going to be right." He stood there a moment longer. Then he took his hand away and walked back to his truck. Tucked under the driver's side wiper blade was a piece of paper, folded once. He opened it. 4 words in block letters, written with a heavy pen. "You should have stayed out." No signature, no name. Someone had been watching him, or had followed him, or had simply known where a man like Harlan Combs would go on an afternoon like this one, and had taken the time to make sure he understood that the community's judgment was already forming. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket and got in the truck and drove home. He would give the note to Marcus Webb in the morning. Tonight he sat on the porch and watched the ridge go dark and didn't think about who had left it, because thinking about it wouldn't tell him anything he didn't already know. The town had made up its mind about him, part of it anyway. The other part would make up its mind later. That was the nature of a place where everyone knew everyone and every action cast a long shadow. He had known that when he made the first call to Ruth, even if he hadn't let himself say so. You found a thing buried 30 years in the earth, you brought it up into the light, and then you had to live with what the light showed. That was the deal. He'd made it. He wasn't going back on it now. The federal courthouse in Lexington was a different country from Pike County. Harlan drove the 70 miles on a Tuesday morning in early October, the mountains behind him and the bluegrass flatlands opening up ahead, the sky wide and gray and indifferent. He wore his good jacket, which he hadn't had occasion to wear in 3 years, and he sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes before he went inside, looking at his hands on the steering wheel and thinking about nothing in particular, which was his way of thinking about everything. The trial had been running for 9 days by the time Harlan was called to testify. He had attended several of the earlier days from the gallery, sitting in the back with Ruth Giles, and once with Thelma Pruitt,
who sat beside him in the hard wooden seat and watched the proceedings with the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting a very long time for something and is afraid to believe it's finally happening. He had watched the prosecutor, Sarah Chen, present the evidence in order. She was methodical and unhurried, and she had a quality that Harlan recognized, the quality of a person who believes that the facts, properly arranged, will do the necessary work without embellishment. She entered the rusted toolbox into evidence on day 2, and the bailiff carried it to a table before the jury. And 12 Pike County adjacent citizens looked at it the way people look at objects they understand to carry a weight beyond their physical mass. The rust, the corroded clasp, the oilcloth staining still visible inside the lid. Chen held up each tool in turn, the hammer, the chisels, the handsaw, and directed the jury's attention to the initials carved and burned into the handles. R.P. She did not editorialize. She simply showed them. David Hoskins testified on day 6. He was 63 now, a thin man who had aged badly, his hands moving on the rail of the witness box the way hands move when they have not found a resting place in a long time. He testified with the demeanor of a man who had agreed to do something he should have refused 30 years ago, and had spent every year since carrying the weight of that agreement. When the prosecutor asked him to describe what Dwayne Caldwell had offered him in exchange for his testimony, Hoskins's voice dropped so low that the judge asked him twice to speak up. $5,000, Hoskins said. He offered me $5,000 to say I saw Raymond Pruitt on Hambly Boulevard the night before the fire. I never saw Raymond Pruitt there. I didn't see anything. I was at my sister's house in Belfry that whole week. He stopped. He pressed his lips together. I needed the money. I was behind on everything. I told myself it didn't matter because Raymond was probably guilty anyway, because that's what you tell yourself when you know you're doing wrong and you need a reason to do it anyway. He looked at his hands on the railing. I've been telling myself that for 30 years. It never got easier to believe. Caldwell's defense attorney cross-examined Hoskins for an hour, pressing on the gaps in his memory, the circumstances of the correspondence, the possibility that the letters had been misinterpreted. Hoskins held his account without variation, which was either the mark of a man telling the truth or of a man who had committed so thoroughly to his new testimony that he could not be shaken from it. The jury, from what Harlan could see from the gallery, was watching Hoskins' hands more than his face. The defense made its argument in earnest on days 7 and 8. The attorney was a composed man from Frankfurt who wore good shoes and had clearly prepared thoroughly. He argued that investigative procedures in 1995 were different, less rigidly documented, more reliant on the judgment of experienced officers. The evidence inconsistencies, he said, were the predictable result of a busy deputy managing a large active crime scene. The missing photographs were a cataloging failure, not an act of concealment. The correspondence with Hoskins was ambiguous and might indicate a legal confidential informant arrangement rather than the criminal payment the prosecution alleged. Caldwell, the attorney said, was a decorated officer with 28 years of service who had dedicated his career to the safety of Pike County. And the prosecution was asking the jury to reinterpret an entire career through the lens of one contested case. It was competent work. Under different circumstances, it might have been enough. On day 10, Harlan took the stand. He stated his name, his occupation, his age. He described the Garrett property job, the barn foundation removal, the methodical excavation, the artifacts he'd found before the toolbox. He described the toolbox itself, the depth, the soil compaction, the oilcloth, the condition of the tools. He described opening it and finding the initials and recognizing them. He described the call to Ruth, the inconsistencies she found, Marcus Webb's arrival. He described Caldwell's visit to his home, the kitchen table, the hands folded, the calm and reasonable voice suggesting that some truths destroyed communities. The prosecutor let the description of Caldwell's visit sit for a moment before she spoke again. "Mr. Combs," she said, "after Deputy Caldwell's visit to your home, you placed a call to Investigator Webb in which you attempted to retract your original account of the toolbox discovery." "I did," Harlan said, "and you offered an alternative explanation that Raymond Pruitt might have buried his own tools on the Garrett property for reasons unrelated to the investigation." "Yes." "Why did you offer that explanation?" Harlan looked at the prosecutor. He was aware of Caldwell sitting at the defense table to his left. He had been aware of it since he sat down, the way you are aware of a presence in a room even when you're looking elsewhere. He had not looked at Caldwell directly. He did now, briefly. Caldwell was looking at the table in front of him. His jaw was set. "Because I was afraid," Harlan said, "not of being hurt, of being responsible for what would come of it. A man I'd known my whole life, sitting in my kitchen, asking me in reasonable terms to consider what I was about to do to the community. That's a hard thing to dismiss." "But you did dismiss it," the prosecutor said. "Eventually." He paused. "I got a phone call from Thelma Pruitt, Raymond's daughter. She called to thank me. She's 58 years old, and she spent her whole adult life carrying the shame of a father in prison for something he didn't do. And her children, Raymond's grandchildren, they grew up believing their grandfather was a criminal." He stopped. He could feel the jury watching him. He wasn't performing anything, he was just telling it. "After that call, I understood that staying silent wasn't protecting anybody. It was protecting the wrong version of events. A dead man's name was wrong. That matters." "Mr. Combs," the prosecutor said, "why didn't you remain silent?" Harlan took a breath. "Because the truth was more important than my comfort. And because a man spent 30 years in prison for something he didn't do, and he's dead now, and he can't speak for himself. Somebody had to." The defense attorney's cross-examination lasted 40 minutes. He asked Harlan about his relationship with Caldwell. They weren't close, Harlan said, just county acquaintances. He asked whether Harlan had any reason to harbor ill will toward law enforcement. He did not, Harlan said. He asked whether Harlan had considered that his identification of the toolbox initials might have been a mistake, a projection. Harlan said he had considered it, and that he was not in the habit of projecting initials onto objects. The jury went out on the afternoon of day 13. They came back in 8 hours. The courtroom had that particular quality of held breath that precedes a verdict. The gallery absolutely still. The ambient noise of the building outside suddenly audible through the walls. Someone's chair creaking once, and then not again. The jury foreman was a heavy-set man in his 50s who had the look of a person who had taken the responsibility seriously and was not glad to be done with it. He stood and read the verdict on each count in a level voice, and the words came the way they always came. Guilty, 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 and each one landed in the room like something being set down after a long carry. Harlan watched Caldwell. He didn't move. He sat at the defense table with his hands folded and his face showing nothing at all. And Harlan thought of a man who has known this was coming and has decided that the one thing remaining in his control is the display of it. At the back of the courtroom, Caldwell's family, a woman who was his sister, 2 adult sons, rose from their seats and moved toward the door. They did not look at Caldwell as they passed. One of the sons put his hand briefly on the back of a bench as he went by, a small gesture of steadying himself. Then they were gone. The sentencing came 3 weeks later. Harlan drove back to Lexington for it and sat in the gallery beside Ruth Giles and Thelma Pruitt. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had been on the federal bench for 17 years, spoke for 6 minutes before she gave the number. She said that Caldwell's crime was not merely the destruction of one man's life, though that alone would have been sufficient for the sentence she was about to impose. She said the crime was also the corruption of the apparatus of justice itself, the deliberate turning of the law against the person it was designed to protect. She said the court did not know how many people had not spoken up because they trusted Caldwell's authority and assumed the system had gotten it right, but that the number was certainly more than 0. She gave him 12 years. Caldwell received it the same way he'd received the verdict. Still. Empty. The marshals came for him, and he stood and straightened his jacket and walked with them out of the courtroom. and that was the last Harlan saw of him. Outside the courthouse, in the gray October light, Thelma Pruitt found him on the steps. She was shorter than he'd imagined from her voice on the phone, a small, sturdy woman with dark eyes and her father's quality of stillness. She took both of his hands in hers and held them for a moment without speaking, which was its own kind of speech. "The governor signed it," she said. "The exoneration. He signed it the day before the trial started. My father is officially recognized by the state of Kentucky as an innocent man." Harlan nodded. He didn't trust his voice immediately. "I'm starting a fund," she said, "in my father's name. Legal review for people who may have been wrongfully convicted. I need people who can speak about how evidence gets buried, how a community accepts a verdict without questioning it, how the toolbox ends up under the barn and stays there for 30 years. She looked at him steadily. "I'd like you to help. When you're ready." "I'll help," Harlan said. He didn't hesitate this time. She squeezed his hands once and released them, and turned back toward the courthouse steps, where a woman from the Attorney General's office was waiting for her with a folder of papers. Harlan stood on the steps and watched her go. Then he went to the parking garage, found his truck, and drove back toward the mountains. He thought about Raymond Pruitt's grave. He thought about the stone and what it said and what it didn't say. He thought that it needed to say something different now, and that Thelma knew it, and that it would be changed, and that the changing of it would not give Raymond 30 years back, but would at least make the record true. That was not nothing. In the long run, he had come to believe, it was almost everything. 6 months after the trial, Pike County had not resolved itself into anything comfortable. The revelation had settled into the community the way a crack settles into a foundation, not dramatic, not sudden, but structural. People had arranged themselves on either side of it and were living with the arrangement, which was the best that could be said. There were those who had decided that Dwayne Caldwell was a man who had made one catastrophic mistake in a long career otherwise conducted with integrity. That the mistake had been rooted in human weakness rather than malice, and that while what he'd done was wrong, it was the wrong of a flawed person rather than a fundamentally corrupt one. These people did not, as a rule, say this loudly, but they thought it, and you could tell they thought it by the way they changed the subject when Caldwell's name came up, by the way they had a second reason ready when you asked why they felt sympathy, by the careful distance they maintained from the words guilty and fraud and 30 years. There were others who saw it clearly and said so. A man had used his badge and his authority to destroy an innocent man's life for personal revenge. And the community had accepted his verdict without question for 30 years. And that acceptance was not simply naivety, but something closer to willful comfort. The comfort of not asking hard questions about the people and institutions you've trusted. These people tended to be harder on themselves in the accounting, which was its own kind of integrity. Harlan lived in the middle of both camps and belonged to neither, and went to work in the morning the same as he always had. His fence-building business had changed shape. He'd lost 7 regular customers in the first 3 months after the trial. Not dramatically, no confrontations, just calls that stopped coming from people whose properties he'd maintained for years. He understood it without excusing it. A man who had exposed a decorated officer was a man who had demonstrated a willingness to expose things, and some people found that quality unsettling in someone they'd been inviting onto their land. On the other side of the ledger, he'd taken on 4 new clients who had sought him out specifically because they'd read the coverage and wanted the work done by a man they felt they could trust. It was a smaller business than before, but it was honest work done for honest reasons, and it paid his bills. The new work was different from anything he'd expected. Thelma Pruitt had established the Pruitt Exoneration Fund 3 months after the trial, incorporating it as a nonprofit with offices in Pikeville and Lexington. The fund retained a staff of 2 attorneys who reviewed applications from inmates and their families claiming wrongful conviction. Thelma had asked Harlan to serve on the advisory board and to speak, when asked, to groups and institutions about how physical evidence could be concealed and how communities absorbed verdicts without scrutiny. He had done it reluctantly at first. He was not a man who spoke to rooms of strangers.
He was a fence builder. He measured twice and cut once and went home. But the first time he spoke, at a law school in Lexington, 23 students in a seminar on wrongful conviction, he had found that the students weren't asking him to perform anything. They wanted to know how the toolbox had been buried, and how deep, and how the soil compacted around it. They wanted to know what he had felt when he recognized the initials. They wanted to understand the specific texture of a community's acceptance, how a verdict became truth not through examination, but through accumulation. He could speak to those things honestly. He had lived them. He drove home from that first lecture thinking he would probably do it again. In the spring, the stone on Raymond Pruitt's grave was changed. Thelma had arranged it and paid for it herself. The new stone was the same gray granite, the same modest size, but the inscription was different. Raymond Pruitt, it read now, with his birth and death years, and beneath that, innocent. One word. Thelma had debated adding more, wrongfully convicted, exonerated by the state, but had finally decided that one word was the right word and that the right word needed no company. Harlan drove to the cemetery when the new stone was set. He stood before it for a while. The grass around it was neatly trimmed. Thelma had been. The Pruitt Fund's first case concluded in early summer, 14 months after the fund was incorporated. A woman named Leona Whitmore, imprisoned for 32 years on a murder conviction that 3 attorneys now agreed contained critical evidentiary problems, was exonerated by the state of Tennessee and released from a correctional facility outside Nashville on a Thursday morning in June. Thelma called Harlan the night before and asked if he wanted to come. He drove to Nashville in the early morning. The release happened at 7:15. Leona Whitmore walked through a gate in a parking lot and into the arms of a daughter she had last held when the girl was 9 years old, who was now 41 and who had driven from Birmingham with her own children, Leona's grandchildren, who had never met her, to be there. Leona was 67. She walked out of the gate with the particular careful step of a person relearning the experience of ground that is not institutional, that does not have the same dimensions it has always had. She stopped inside the parking lot and looked at the sky for a long time. Then her daughter reached her, and they stood together holding each other and not moving. And the grandchildren stood back a little, uncertain of the protocol, which was understandable because there was no protocol for this, and there never had been. Harlan stood beside Thelma and watched. He thought about Raymond Pruitt in the fall of 1995, walking into a Pike County courtroom at 42 years old, and knowing what was coming and being unable to stop it. He thought about the 30 years between that courtroom and Raymond's grave. He thought about what those years had felt like from inside them, and he knew he could not fully imagine it, and that the inability to fully imagine it was its own kind of knowledge. He cried in the parking lot. He was 64 years old, and he stood in a parking lot in Nashville and cried, and he didn't do anything about it. Thelma put her hand on his arm briefly. Then she went to meet Leona Whitmore, and Harlan stayed where he was until he could drive safely. Dwayne Caldwell, from what Harlan heard through Marcus Webb and through the ordinary channels of Pike County information, was serving his sentence in a federal facility in Kentucky. He had been described in reports as a model inmate, quiet, compliant, causing no difficulty. Whether this represented genuine remorse or simply the discipline of a man who had spent decades enforcing rules and now understood viscerally what the consequences of breaking them looked like, Harlan couldn't know. He didn't think about Caldwell much. He had found that thinking about Caldwell was like pressing on a bruise. It confirmed the bruise was still there without doing anything useful about it. He had not spoken to Caldwell since the kitchen table. He did not intend to. The unexpected visit came on a Wednesday afternoon in August, when Harlan was rehanging a gate on a property near the Jenkins city limits. He heard a car on the gravel behind him and turned and saw a late-model Buick, dark red, driven by a woman he didn't know. She parked and got out carefully. A woman in her late 60s, small-framed, with gray hair cut short, and the bearing of a person accustomed to conducting herself with deliberateness in all things. She introduced herself as Margaret Caldwell. Harlan set down his tools. They stood in the gravel on the side of the property road, the mountains visible on 3 sides,
the August heat pressing down through a sky that had been threatening rain since morning. "I found out where you were working from the woman who hired you," Margaret said, without apology for the intrusion. "I'd been trying to find a way to speak with you for some time. I didn't know the right way to do it. I decided there probably wasn't a right way and I should just come." "All right," Harlan said. "I want to thank you," she said. "I know that must sound strange, coming from his ex-wife." "It sounds honest," Harlan said. She looked at the mountains for a moment. "Dwayne and I were married for 11 years. We divorced in '93. The reasons were the usual ones. We wanted different things, and we'd been pretending otherwise for too long. But Dwayne—" She stopped. She chose her words with the deliberateness he'd already attributed to her. "Dwayne couldn't accept that I had moved on, particularly that I had spent time with Raymond. Raymond built the deck on my house in '94. We had a pleasant few months. It wasn't serious, or it wouldn't have been. But Dwayne, he took it as a personal verdict on him, as though my having any life after our marriage was a judgment he needed to answer." "He kept a photograph," Harlan said. "I know, they told me at the trial." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know about any of it until the arrest. I want you to understand that. I didn't know what he'd done to Raymond. If I had—" She stopped again. "I don't know what I would have done, but I hope I would have done something." "I believe you," Harlan said. "Raymond was a gentle man," she said. "A capable man who worked hard and kept to himself and was kind when you gave him the occasion to be. He didn't deserve any of it." She looked at Harlan directly. "What you did, finding it, and then not letting it stay buried, that was the right thing. I know it cost you something here. I know how this county talks. But you gave Raymond's daughter the truth, and you gave Raymond's name back to his grandchildren, and that matters. I wanted to say that to the person who did it." Harlan thanked her. He meant it. She told him that her family, her own children from her second marriage, had been shaken by the revelation, by their proximity to what Caldwell had done. She said they were managing. She said families managed, generally, if they were willing to look at what was actually in front of them, instead of what they wished was there. She asked if he would come to dinner sometime. She said it lightly and without pressure, as an open door rather than an expectation. He said he would. She drove away down the gravel road, and Harlan stood in the August heat and watched the dust settle behind her car. Then he picked up his tools and finished rehanging the gate, because the gate still needed hanging, and because the work was in front of him, and that had always been enough to keep him moving. He drove home that evening through the mountains, the light going gold on the ridgetops, the hollers filling with shadow the way they did each evening, the same as they had done his entire life. He thought that Pike County was a complicated place, that it always had been, and that the complications were not going away. That a community could accept a false verdict for 30 years and then, slowly and incompletely, and with significant disagreement, begin to correct it. That beginning to correct it was not the same as correcting it, but it was the available thing, the thing that could actually be done. And he had learned in the past year that the available thing was worth doing, even when it was insufficient. He had a new job in the morning. A fence line out on Johns Creek Road, a long one, at least 4 days of work. He had the materials already loaded. He went inside and ate supper and went to bed and slept the whole night through, which was something he had not managed easily in a long time. David Hoskins pleaded guilty to perjury and conspiracy in a separate proceeding 4 months after Caldwell's conviction. He received a suspended sentence and 2 years of probation in recognition of his cooperation and the 3 decades he had spent, in his own words, carrying what he'd done. The judge noted that the sentence was not lenient and was not a reward. It was simply what the facts supported. Hoskins moved to his sister's house in Belfry and has not been heard from publicly since. Sheriff Hayes commissioned an internal review of the department's evidence handling procedures. The review found no systemic issues beyond the Caldwell matter. Hayes made the findings public. Some people in Pike County thought this was the right thing to do. Others thought it was self-serving. Hayes retired the following year.
His successor posted the updated evidence protocols on the department's public board, where they remain. Ruth Giles retired from the county courthouse after 39 years of service, 8 months after the trial concluded. At her retirement gathering, held in the courthouse conference room on a Friday afternoon, attended by 17 people, the county judge executive presented her with a framed letter of commendation for her role in initiating the Pruitt Review. Ruth accepted it, set it on the table beside the cake, and spent the rest of the afternoon talking with people she had worked alongside for decades. She took the letter home when she left. Nobody saw whether she looked at it again. Thelma Pruitt's office in Pikeville has 19 photographs on the wall now. Each one shows a person on the day of their exoneration, outside a courthouse or a prison gate or a parking lot. Each photograph has a date written in marker on the white border beneath it, the day the record was corrected and the name was made right. Thelma adds a photograph each time the fund achieves a successful exoneration. She does not add them for the cases that are still pending, of which there are currently 11. She says the pending wall is in her head, which is enough. The fund receives, on average, 2 new applications each month. In the late fall of the year after the trial, Harlan took a fence repair job on a property out on Route 23. On the drive back into Pikeville, he passed the old Garrett place. He slowed down. The barn was gone. The foundation stones were gone. Where the eastern corner had sunk into the hillside, there was now level ground, graded clean and covered in gray gravel, exactly as the new owners had wanted. A tidy rectangle of stone dust where a barn had stood for 80 years. The excavation filled in, the surface smoothed over, nothing to show for what had been underneath. Harlan sat with the engine idling at the edge of the road for a moment. He looked at the gravel pad. He thought about the 8 inches of compressed earth, the oilcloth, the rust, the 2 letters cut into a hammer handle by a man who had put his name on his tools the way a man does when his tools are the truest thing he owns. Then he put the truck in gear and drove on. The ridge was going dark to the east. He had materials to unload before the light was gone entirely, and the new job starting in the morning, and supper to make. The road curved down through the holler and the Garrett property disappeared behind the tree line, and after a while he stopped thinking about it. And the drive home was just a drive home through the mountains in the early evening, the same as it had always been.